The largest shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea lies just 2 nautical miles off the coast of Italy. The gigantic hull of an oil tanker is home to hundreds of species of fish and corals. The 1991 environmental catastrophe caused by the sinking of the MT Haven has become a miracle of nature. I heard a mayday from the captain of the Haven, Captain Gregorakis, that said, "Mayday, mayday, I have a fire on board." It's a phrase that you don't expect and that you hope never to hear.
The Haven is a wreck, I would say, that is open to anyone. It starts at minus 36 meters depth, so even recreational divers with a deep water license can visit the first 2 floors of the supertanker.
Diving on the Haven for the first time is an amazing sensation. I remember that I thought how small we are compared to this enormous ship that rests on the sea floor at 80 meters. Although I've seen many other wrecks, both of merchant ships and of warships, diving on the Haven is unique due to its huge dimensions. The bridge where the captain and crew watched the disaster unfold is an eerie reminder that this place was once a hub of activity. Divers explore the inside of the ship, which lies at 86 meters depth. The wreck of the Haven has become one of Europe's great underwater tourist attractions, for those who dare dive to those depths. This is Arenzano, on the Ligurian coast in Italy. It is where a team of divers regularly takes visitors to the Mediterranean's largest wreck, the MT Haven, a ship that burned and sank just 2 nautical miles away. Diving on the Haven wreck is for deep water divers. The Technodive team is based in Arenzano, west of Genoa, a small picturesque port on the Mediterranean Sea. Andrea Bada is the owner of the diving center and welcomes visitors from all over Europe.
Oxygen is what allows us to survive underwater and needs to be loaded slowly. Because oxygen is a flammable gas, and any scraping or any molecule of fat in the tubes or in the thread of the screws can cause the explosion even of part of the bottle. When you load up the helium, there is no problem, because helium isn't a flammable gas. And it's what allows us to dive deep, because we take nitrogen out of the normal compressed air and replace it with helium.
The technique used for diving to the depths of the Haven and beyond involves rebreathers. Andrea Bada is a deep water diver and explorer.
We filled up the helium in the bottle, and we're now going to add whatever air is missing, which is made up of 21% oxygen, 78% of nitrogen, but since the pressure inside the bottle is already 200 bar, we are going to add 30 bar of air that will give us the minimum oxygen needed to survive underwater at depth. These are mixes of gases called trimix. Trimix because it's made up of three gases, so a mix of air with nitrogen, oxygen and helium.
Preparing for such a deep dive also requires careful psychological planning. Any problems that occur at those depths need to be solved underwater.
I ragazzi hanno fatto un ottimo lavoro e stanno facendo un ottimo lavoro sotto
The team has done a lot of psychological and mental work,
hanno aumentato e migliorato notevolmente
increasing their performance through this work, as well as improving their interpersonal relationship
la relazione, il rapporto relazionale
within the group and between the group and the outside world.
con l'esterno. Oggi l'obiettivo più
The work I'm most proud of is that they work in perfect synergy, especially when there are these particularly difficult dives.
soprattutto quando ci sono queste immersioni particolarmente impegnative.
The team makes its way to the port and loads up the dive gear. Today, Andrea is diving with Gabriele Paparo, who is a former Navy diver. He has dived on the wreck dozens of times.
La Haven, sì, è un relitto enorme e è difficile
The
identificare.
Haven is an enormous wreck, and it's hard to say that one part of it is more beautiful than another. It is fantastic everywhere, both when you go into it and when you visit the outside. So anyone who is trained to dive to the hypoxic depths of 80 meters, it presents a fantastic propeller, the biggest ever seen on a wreck. So this by itself is worth seeing. And the same goes for the interior, that not only allows you to explore it, but even use a scooter in those spaces.
Dove addirittura si può non solo nuotare, ma addirittura si potrebbe scooterare all'interno di questi enormi ambienti.
Nicolas has driven all the way from Switzerland to dive on the Haven.
Et la première fois qu'on plonge sur ce bateau,
The first time you dive on this wreck, you think it's impressive because it was a catastrophe, but in fact, life is everywhere. The first thing that impressed me, apart from its size, was that life is everywhere. The second thing that impressed me was the explosion, because the size of the hull is very big, and when you see the hole left by the explosion, you see how big it must have been, and the massive proportions of the initial catastrophe.
la vraie catastrophe que ça a été au départ.
The MT Haven accident is one of the greatest environmental catastrophes ever to hit the Mediterranean Sea. The ship itself was built in the Spanish port of Cadiz in 1973, and at the time was a model for future oil tankers. The need to move huge amounts of oil from one side of the world to the other in the 1970s pushed the shipping industry to ever larger ships. Over time, this would be revealed as a losing strategy. Giancarlo Cerruti was a Genoa port pilot at the time of the catastrophe. His heroism was recognized by the state and other institutions, above all, by the crew. The Haven was 340 meters long. There are those that are 500 tons that are 50 meters longer and wider, but they haven't been built anymore because they find it difficult to get into ports, because they are simply too big and they are too dangerous. The Torre Canyon that ended up on the Seven Stones dropped 120,000 tons of oil into the sea. If a ship like that ends up on the rocks, it causes disaster. A harbinger of what was to come was the wreck of Haven's sister ship, Amoco Cadiz, in 1978. That massive oil spill led to the permanent pollution of thousands of kilometers of French shoreline and the death of innumerable numbers of birds and fish. The ship was simply too big to be safe. The Iran-Iraq War provided further evidence that large oil tankers were a danger to the shorelines and fisheries of the world. While sailing by Karg Island, the Haven was hit by an Exocet missile fired by an Iraqi warplane. The ship was saved, but the damage was extensive. At the time, the Haven was called the Amoco Milford Haven and was loading crude at the island of Karg. She was hit by an Exocet missile during the Iran-Iraq war. She caught fire. They managed to put out the fire, and then she was towed to Singapore. In Singapore, they worked on the ship for a year and a half, but there are doubts that the work may not have been done right. There are doubts. The expert report said there were doubts, because the ship should have remained there for longer. And the Amoco Milford Haven became simply the Haven. On its first voyage, it had the Genoa accident. The impact that this event had on the safety of the ship has never been fully established. The Haven was on its first trip since coming out of repairs, operated by Troodos Shipping of Cyprus, and had sailed all the way from the Persian Gulf to Italy. Due to the sheer size of the ship, it could not sail into port, but instead offloaded the fuel here, at a man-made floating island the Genoese call l'Isola Grande. Something went terribly wrong on that day. The ship had arrived at the floating island and discharged 80,000 tons of oil, but then sailed away to move oil from the bow tank to the central tank to be offloaded when the ship returned to the floating island. It is the 11th of April 1991. Operations aboard the Haven, transferring oil from the bow hold to hold number 2, are proceeding normally. Suddenly, a series of loud explosions rips the air, and the second hold from the bow is on fire. What happened on the day of the explosion that ripped the ship apart and led to the loss of life of 5 sailors has never been fully ascertained. I took the microphone and asked which ship it was, and he says, "I am Haven." And he was out off Voltri, and he said, "Please, pilot, help, help, I have fire on board." So I immediately raised the alarm in the oil port, and I got the driver of the pilot boat, and 15 minutes later we were under the Haven.
Behind me is what the Genoese call Isola Grande. That is, a floating buoy where, until recently, oil tankers, the super oil tankers that were so big as not to be able to dock in the port, sailed up to this buoy and used a pipe connected to the ship and transferred the crude oil. There are huge pipes that go from here to the pumping stations on the shore. This is where the Haven offloaded part of the crude it was carrying and then sailed away to move the oil from one hold to the other, and that's when the accident happened. A big piece of the deck with the valve that malfunctioned is here, close by, 100 meters deep.
When we arrived at the Haven, there was already a huge fire in the bow hold, small fires rising from the center of the ship, but the deck of the ship was still intact. I continued to talk to the ship's captain, and I advised him to launch the lifeboats to get the crew off, because even if we'd raised the alarm with the fire brigade and helicopters, the helicopters would never have been able to hover over the flames because the fire was too big.
The Haven accident was an exceptional accident as far as I was personally concerned, as I lived through it in real time. I remember I was returning from Savona by car, and I wasn't driving. A friend was driving. And as we were reaching Arenzano, he exclaimed, "Look at that oil tanker that's burning." And I turned around to look towards the sea, and I saw these huge, extremely white flames rising skyward, and the first tugboats leaving the port of Voltri and going towards it.
While I was speaking to the captain, the ship was shaken by an enormous explosion. Pieces of sheeting fell on our pilot's boat, and the driver and I were lucky that they were small and only took some of the paint off the boat. We thought that the ship had broken into two sections, but in fact the ship was just bent, and from the crack, oil began flowing out in flames, and it covered practically the whole ship. Luckily, not the end of the stern section, from which the crew began jumping into the water, from the end of the stern section that was not yet involved in the fire.
Guarda, è saltata quando io stavo terminando gli studi superiori.
The Haven accident happened when I was at high school, and it was like a flashback. I was catapulted into my school books with the pictures of the Torrey Canyon, of the news reports on the Yamoko Cadiz, or the Exxon Valdez, that seemed so far off and so remote. So we were catapulted into the limelight of an ecological disaster that seemed to be of truly gigantic proportions.
Che sembrava essere di proporzioni veramente immani.
Però il comandante non l'ho più sentito, probabilmente è morto mentre...
I heard nothing more from the captain. He was probably killed during the enormous explosion that broke the ship, not in two, but completely bent it. We went around the whole ship, and when we got to the stern of the ship, we saw the crew jumping off. We collected 18, covered in crude oil and in shock. But 3 young men that were calling out, "Help! Pilot, help!" We got 5 meters away with the pilot boat. We saw them burn like 3 torches. We didn't manage to get any closer with the pilot boat because we would have burned it. Luca Parodi is a marine biologist and has watched the wreck change over the years.
Fortunatamente l'incendio che è perdurato.
Luckily, the oil had burnt, and the fact that they'd already offloaded some of the crude oil, and an excellent response by the emergency services and so forth, significantly reduced the environmental impact of the Haven disaster on the Ligurian Sea.
L'impatto ambientale.
Genoa is like an amphitheatre. We were all spectators of this tragedy that was unfolding in front of our eyes.
Spettatori di questa tragedia che si consumava di fronte ai nostri occhi.
There was a combination of circumstances, such as the relative humidity, temperature of the oil, air temperature, that thankfully led to the oil catching fire. And we have to say that it was lucky that the oil caught fire, because otherwise all these beaches, well, if 200,000 tons of oil leak out and spread, getting rid of it. Luckily, it caught fire. Because it caught fire, some men died, unfortunately. But the fact that it caught fire saved Liguria. The northerly wind and calm seas kept the smoke from reaching shore. Admiral Antonio Alati of the Coast Guard realized that there was a real danger of a major oil slick and immediately surrounded the ship with oil booms as fire tugs continued to push the oil back into the flames.
Praticamente 2 o 3 campi di calcio.
Practically, the fire occupied the size of 2 or 3 football fields because the crude oil that fell into the sea caught fire, luckily. But controlling it was almost impossible. And luckily, the tugs used their high-pressure hydrants as the oil expanded on the sea, pushed it back into the fire using their hydrants, and so they managed to make a lot of it burn. As the wreck was being towed, it broke in two and sank. But at least the wreck was now in shallower waters, and the leaks of fuel could be monitored.
subito, immediatamente, è stato
So immediately afterwards, the Haven disaster turned into an unimaginable environmental disaster. I remember all these beaches covered with oil, with seagulls dying, all those things that you see on TV that you think can never happen to you. All of us older people lived through it. We thought we'd never be able to go to the sea again. Then in fact, luckily, a lot of it burnt, and a lot of it crystallized on the sea floor, so over the years it hasn't left a lot of damage, except to fishing.
Parlando col sindaco che per svariati mesi
I spoke to the mayor, who put containers of benzene and gasoline for the bathers so that they could clean their bodies of patches of crude oil that got stuck on them as they came out of the sea. From an initial disaster that involved the death of fish, seagulls and other birds, from the death of all this fauna and animals that washed up on the shore, once this catastrophe passed, from one year to the next, it became a paradise.
Passata questa sciagura, quindi passati gli anni, è diventato via via sempre di più un paradiso.
Environmentalists calculate that of the 230,000 tons of fuel aboard, 80,000 had been transferred to land, while between 30 and 40,000 spilled into the sea and partly burned, leaving 110,000 in the holds. The leaks were still extremely damaging to the pristine coastline of Liguria, one of the most beautiful stretches of coast of Europe, with the picturesque ports of Arenzano and Portofino and the villages of the Cinque Terre. But being able to monitor the leaks meant that the environmental disaster was small compared to, say, the Amoco Cadiz catastrophe.
Io mi ricordo che avevo cercato.
I remember that I did some work for the National Research Center of Messina, who asked me to collect the crude oil because they wanted to analyze it for microbacteria. So several years after the ship sank, I dived to the bottom of the hold, and I remember that the oil was stratified, like a viennetta. I went down with a friend and we brought up 4 bags of it, and it was like the chocolate of a viennetta ice cream. And I think it's still there. It's at the bottom, crystallized, and doesn't do any harm to anyone. It's as though it were in a closed jar.
The investigation reached no firm conclusion about who was responsible, and no one was found guilty of negligence. The Troodos family of Cyprus, who operated the ship, was accused of making savings on repairs after the Exocet attack, but no evidence was brought to support the claims.
L'Haven aveva già scaricato 140.000 tonnellate di prodotto.
The Haven had already offloaded 140,000 tons of product, but to be able to sail off again, they had to redistribute the crude oil into the different tanks, and that's when the mistake was made. The inquiry says that tank number 1 was put under pressure, and this pressure was not relieved, and this pressure broke down the bulwark between number 1 and number 2 that was full of oxygen. As it fell, the bulwark made sparks, and the fire broke out. Lorenzo Veneziano was one of the first to dive on the wreck and see for himself.
Sono state fatte tante inchieste sulla Haven. In realtà,
There have been several inquests into the Haven accident, and although no certain cause has been found, the most probable cause is that when crude oil was being transferred from one tank to another, a valve that was used to decompress, to remove gas from inside the tanks, failed. So the compression caused by moving the oil from one tank to the next put the gas in the tank under pressure that couldn't be released, that acted like a diesel combustion engine and exploded.
non sfogando per compressione, ha fatto come in un motore a scoppio a diesel e è esplosa.
The Italian state eventually paid for the cleanup, and the Trudos family continued their entrepreneurial careers, eventually buying the British airline EasyJet. However, over the years, the sunken ship took on a new life at the bottom of the sea.
È uno dei relitti più ambiti al mondo.
It is one of the most sought-after wrecks in the world, certainly for its size, but above all for its biodiversity, for everything that's around it. Over the years, all these incrustations and the microorganisms that grew on it turned it into an ideal habitat for several hundred species of fish, and brought to the wreck shoals of anchovies and shoals of snappers, black and common sea breams, and something that can be seen in very few places in the world, that is, the passage of tuna.
Ovvero il passaggio dei tonni.
Maddalena Fava is a marine ecologist who has documented the evolution of changing marine life around the wreck over the years.
Dal petrolio è stato bonificato, in parte quando la venne affondata.
So the ship was cleaned up. During the disaster, the oil was allowed to burn, so that a part of the oil was dispersed into the atmosphere. The heavier part of the oil that remained in the ship was removed by humans over several years. But nature gave its contribution too, as certain natural bacteria exist in the sand that are able to break down crude oil into its component parts. So being able to feed off it, we're able to break it down and contribute to the cleanup.
Il petrolio, quindi il cibo che gli permette di crescere, l'hanno degradato e hanno contribuito anche loro in qualche modo alla bonifica.
Tuna fish of between 30 and 150 to 170 kilos come onto the wreck to feed off the anchovies. This, unfortunately, is wonderful, but extremely difficult to see. That is, tuna fish diving from between 6 and 8 meters to 30 meters in a few seconds, chasing the anchovies and trying to hunt them. It has become an aquarium. Divers come here not only to see the wreck, but to enjoy the clouds of fish that surround the wreck.
Che avvolgono il relitto stesso.
La base della piramide alimentare sono le alghe.
The base of the food pyramid is the seaweed. They are the first to grow, but the process of growth of the haven ecosystem started with bacteria that grew on and began degrading the oil, and then slowly fish that live in hollows, or crustaceans, lobsters or mollusks, who need protection in a place where otherwise there would be no protection because the ship sank onto a mudflat, but close to the shore, so offered a new place where they could hide. And then the seaweed and simple organisms are followed by small fish, then bigger fish hunting the smaller fish, and so on.
Pian piano la catena alimentare aumenta e arrivano I piccoli pesci e poi I pesci più grossi che cercano I piccoli pesci e così via.
The wreck of the MT Haven lies some 2 nautical miles off the Ligurian coast, at a depth of over 80 meters. The ship is so tall that from the funnel to the propeller is 50 meters in depth.
un tipo di nave che...
It's the kind of ship that luckily no longer sails in our seas because not even one has survived. The Exxon Valdez, the Erika, were all ships this size, so too big, built in a hurry. They all had problems and all caused incredible disasters.
For the intrepid diver, the ship is one of the most popular wrecks in the crystal clear waters of Italy. Andrea and Gabriele, accompanied by a boatman, go out to the dive site. The divers have arrived at the dive site. They prepare their equipment. It weighs some 40 kilos, and there is time for one last check.
Stagna, ossigeno di backup, 0,8 respirabile, impostato a 0,8. Stagna e cav
0707, 200 bar di ossigeno e 230 di diluente.
The weather is fine, but there are still dangers. Lorenzo Veneziano taught Bada everything he knows about diving and is acutely aware of the risks.
La Haven, senza ombra di dubbio, ripeto, è un'immersione.
The Haven, if you follow the rules, is a dive that anyone can do. It's relatively simple. Let's remember that we're in the middle of the sea, a difficult sea. And it doesn't take much to turn an easy dive into a difficult dive. Anything can happen. I'll tell you a story. It was autumn and the sea was flat, and I loaded the clients up in the port of Arenzano in my boat. I went down into the water, and as I came up, a terrible storm had blown in. Waves 2 meters high, so bad was it that I couldn't get to the port of Arenzano. I had to take the clients to Genoa. This happened within 20 minutes or half an hour, so not only the divers but also the boatman and the dive centre owner have to be up to it.
Tutta una catena.
The dive is dark, and Bada turns on the lights, and then the ghostly ship appears in front of them. The sheer size is amazing, and the divers have 20 minutes to explore her before their oxygen runs out. It is the world's largest tanker, a giant from a bygone age.
La Haven è un relitto che...
The Haven is a wreck, just to get some dimensions, that rises from a depth of 80 meters to a depth of 36 meters.
A meno 36 metri.
So its huge size can be compared to a block of flats, a big block of flats, even a small skyscraper. The accommodation block that stands at the stern of the ship starts at 50 meters depth and reaches 36 meters and is a 5-story building. So 5 stories and the captain's quarters. A building of almost 6 stories standing on a ship. And below it we go from 50 to 80 meters below the surface, so another 30 meters. The wreck is 270 meters long, so practically 2.5 soccer fields in length, and 50 meters wide, so as wide as half a soccer field.
Mezzo campo da calcio.
It was able to carry a massive 233,000 tons of crude oil at the time, and was manned by a crew of 44. The engine room is massive and hosts a single diesel engine. The team makes its way outside and examines the ship's propeller. This truly is the giant of the seas.
Solo la sala macchine, quindi dove è alloggiato il motore.
The engine room alone, where the engine is located, is the size of a house, because the engine was not inserted afterwards, but the ship was built around it.
È stato messo sopra durante la costruzione della nave.
Everything that is inside it is gigantic. Everything and anything that you film and you explore is huge. The spare piston rods are as tall as 2 men.
È gigantesco. Già solo i pistoni di scorta che ci sono grossi come 2 persone.
The Haven wreck luckily lies level and goes from about 40 meters below sea level down to about 76, 78 meters. It's split in two, with the bow section broken off, but the stern section is perfectly preserved and beautiful. As you dive down along the drop lines, you reach the funnel, which is the safest part, and from there you descend down the decks that are all well preserved, down to 50 meters to the main deck.
I ponti sono molto belli, declinano fino a 55 metri che si arriva proprio sulla coperta.
The propeller is about 78 meters down. You can also go inside the Haven. This is a whole different issue because, as with any dive inside a wreck, even if she is huge, there are dangers.
Nasconde delle insidie.
At this depth, the natural flora and fauna of the Mediterranean have been able to colonize the wreck as though it were a massive coral reef. Life abounds around what was once a bringer of death and destruction.
Dal castello si riesce ad accedere.
From the accommodation block, you can get to the engine room in 2 ways. One way is more difficult, as it is inside the wreck. So descending from the 5th deck and the kitchens, not down the stairs, as they have partially collapsed, but via the corridors through a door that leads into the engine room. This approach can be done by divers who have a license for the exploration of caves and grottos, people who are capable of using guidelines and can work in narrow and difficult spaces.
E di orientarsi in posti angusti, stretti e difficili.
The ship was powered by a single-screw diesel engine that turned a massive propeller, which could push the ship to a speed of 15 knots.
All'interno della sala macchine si può vedere questo enorme motore.
The enormous engine is visible inside the engine room. You can go down to 60 meters where you can see the rocker arms, where the pump and injectors were. And this is divided into 3 floors. The first, where the piston heads and valves are. The second floor, where the central part of the engine is. And the third floor, that you reach through a hatch, where the pistons and the connecting rods are.
The pumping station is where the accident started, with a defective extraction valve that allowed gases to accumulate and eventually ignite. It is the heart of the MT Haven story and holds the key to the sequence of events that killed 4 people. Today, the MT Haven is an underwater paradise. There are dangers here too, for divers and for the fauna. Fishing nets still cover the wreck and threaten those swimming around them. They are nylon nets and don't rot easily.
Come tutti i relitti, naturalmente.
Like all wrecks, the Haven has what we call its clothes. When we say that a wreck is dressed, it's when it's covered in nets.
Le reti di per sé non rappresentano.
The nets aren't a danger for the diver, rather they're a danger for the environment.
Un pericolo per l'ambiente.
They are a danger because they are no longer made of natural material, as they were once many years ago, but they're made of synthetic material.
Sono fatte non più con materiali naturali come venivano costruite.
That have a very low level of biodegradability.
E quindi hanno un indice di biodegradabilità che è veramente, veramente basso.
And they will continue to disturb and capture fish for no reason, for a long time to come.
Catturare pesci senza scopo alcuno per lungo tempo.
The 20 minutes exploring the wreck have come to an end. It is time to resurface. But this is a slow process. Andrea Bada has risked his life before during this particularly dangerous part of the day. Rising to the surface too quickly can cause what divers know as the bends, nitrogen bubbles that block the arteries, an often fatal condition. Decompression times are proportional to the depth of the dive. The deeper you go, the longer it will take to come back up.
Il relitto della Haven si presta a queste immersioni molto profonde, ovviamente.
The dive on the Haven takes you down to significant depths. And of course, when you dive to those depths, to 30, 50, or even 80 meters, the diver has to come up following certain rules, at a certain speed, but not only. Depending on the depths you reach, and on a wreck like this, it is easy to spend several minutes, tens of minutes, exploring the carcass of the wreck. So, due to the length of time you spend on the wreck, you have to spend a long time in decompression. Decompression is the technique that involves stopping at precise depths, from 30 meters below every 3 meters, so a slow resurfacing that takes half an hour or 40 minutes of decompression. This, obviously for safety reasons, and to complete the dive profile as required.
E per completare correttamente il profilo dell'immersione stessa.
The day is drawing to an end. The team resurface and pass the heavy bottles to the boatman before climbing back into the boat. It has been a successful team operation in which no one was hurt or lost their calm.
Come sappiamo, lo psicologo dello sport
As we all know, the sports psychologist's job is to improve the performance. And performance is improved above all through management of the emotions and of relationships whenever you're in a team. The best result, which is the result we've obtained with the tech dive team, is to work in perfect synergy, as though the team acted as though it were a single individual.
Riuscire a lavorare in una sinergia totale, come se il gruppo si muovesse come un singolo individuo.
The team is returning to port, full of wonder, adrenaline, and a sense of accomplishment from completing a successful dive to an enormous wreck, an underwater island of rusting steel that teems with life like never before. Now, literally, a haven for both the curious diver and thousands of creatures of the deep.